finishing a series of messages we began 6 weeks ago. No, because of the 2 weeks of Hurricane Armageddon. Really, 8 weeks ago, was it Sandy? Didn't have light for like 3 weeks. It was terrible. Where's Lisa Bates? Stayed at her house for 3 weeks. I just want to say I love Mama. She housed us for 3 weeks. It was amazing. Who doesn't have light yet? Oh, whose house is still damaged from that? We found out some people are in hotels still from having damaged homes. It's incredible. Well, we're ready next time. How many of you guys have a generator now? You are ready for any storm.
We're saving up for it.
You're saving up generator. There you go. Yeah, hey, we're saving up too. Anyway, let me get to the point. We are finishing our message series through the life of Joseph. We've been studying the life of Joseph in the book of Genesis. And tonight we're going to conclude it. And so let me do a quick recap, because if you're joining us for the first time or you're returning for the second time, you might be like, well, I haven't been, I don't know what's going on. So here's what's going on. Joseph, we first meet Joseph in the book of Genesis, chapter 37. And when we meet Joseph, he's a 17-year-old bratty little kid who is a dreamer. He's the youngest in a very dysfunctional family, and we talked about that in the first message. Being a dreamer very early in life at 17, he has two prophetic dreams that God reveals to him in those dreams that he is someday as an adult going to be a very successful, very important, very influential leader. So much so in the dream that God showed him his siblings coming to pay homage to him. Now, due to his teenage immaturity, Joseph, instead of keeping that dream quiet and trusting God to bring it to fruition, Joseph decides that he's going to brag about it to his brothers, who, by the way, can't stand his guts. They hate him, right? And so his father, named Jacob, doesn't help matters much, because Jacob essentially plays favorite with Joseph. Like, his brothers already hate him, but Joseph plays favorites with him. He gives him some of the best stuff in the house. And so over time, an already toxic relationship between Joseph and his brothers gets even worse, and 10 out of the 11 brothers begin to plot his murder. I mean, this is how dysfunctional this family is. They want to kill their stepbrother. However, the brothers at some point, while they're scheming to kill Joseph, decide that it is more profitable to sell Joseph into slavery than it is to actually kill him. And so they sell him off to a bunch of Ishmaelites, and so Joseph is essentially hauled away from his home in Canaan, and he's yanked away and immersed into Egyptian culture and sold off there as a slave. Now, in Egypt, Joseph is a slave. He's actually a poor slave, obviously a slave. He's poor, but he's a very diligent worker, and God's favor is with him. And eventually, Joseph catches the attention of his boss, a high-ranking official in Pharaoh's palace named Potiphar. And Joseph essentially gets a promotion as a slave. He becomes the head of Potiphar's household. And so things are looking good for a while, and the scripture makes the point to say that Joseph prospered in Egypt because God's favor was with him. However, things go south pretty quickly because Mrs. Potiphar can't keep her hands to herself. She wants to sleep around with him, but Joseph is a man of honor, and he refuses her. And so she is a woman scorned, and so she accuses him of trying to sexually assault her, and Joseph is once again back in prison. I mean, he's just gone from the hot frying pan, jumped out thinking he was escaping, right into fire. Anyway, while he is incarcerated in prison, he meets two high-ranking officials who work closely with King Pharaoh, and does one of them a really huge favor. But as soon as that one gets out of prison, he basically forgets Joseph, and Joseph is left to rot in prison for a few more years. During that period, while Joseph is in prison, God shows King Pharaoh another prophetic dream, and in that dream it's very vivid. King Pharaoh sees visions of animals and his crop. Basically, there's going to be a famine in the land. There's going to be a drought. There's going to be shortage of food, but he doesn't really understand what the dream means, and so he's looking for someone to interpret it. And it's at that point that Joseph is called upon, because boy's got interpretive skills. He can interpret dreams. And so he comes to Pharaoh, not only interprets the dream, but basically lays out a game plan. So he doesn't just interpret the dream, he lays out a game plan for what King Pharaoh should do to save his country. Well, Pharaoh and all his officials are so impressed by his wisdom that in one afternoon, Joseph goes from prisoner in the penitentiary to the White House. He goes from a zero to hero. I just wanted to say that. I've been looking for a good place to say that. Should have come out as a rap, but I couldn't pull it off, right? Joseph goes from an obscure inmate in prison to a key player in the offices of the Pentagon. Essentially, here's what he becomes. In one afternoon, he goes from prisoner to the second most powerful man in all of Egypt, the prime minister of Egypt. And the scripture goes out of its way to make the point that the reason why Joseph continually prospered, even in prison, even in hard times, was because God's favor was with him. God's blessing was upon his life. And that's where we left 2 weeks ago, right? That's where we finished the message. We talked about that story, and tonight we're going to finish it off. But man, the story is about to get really interesting. And here's why it's going to get interesting. Because in the chapter we're going to look at tonight, and really the remaining chapters, Joseph is going to get reunited with his brothers, who, by the way, sold him into slavery. This is where you're supposed to go, ooh. There you go. Okay, that's the best you can do, whatever. All right. He's going to come face to face with his 10-step brothers. It's going to be crazy. Now, my intention tonight is to finish this message series tonight. And I'm laughing because that means I got to cover 8 chapters in the next 30 or so minutes, or however long this is going to take. It ain't going to be long, I think. I got to cover 8 chapters. So, and I tell you that to make the point that I'm going to skip a few sections, and I'm going to summarize a few sections over the next 8 chapters. That's one reason why I want to finish it. But the next reason is one that gets me even more excited. The next reason I want to finish it is because we have 3 more weeks. Actually, I think we have 4 more weeks left in December before the end of the year. And we're going to meet every week until the end of the year. The last weekend of December is a Christmas party, our end of the year party here. But the next 3 weeks, we are starting a brand new message series. Now, let me tell you a little bit about this message series. And Andrew, we're going to hit the lights in a moment. But here at Remix, I'm not really big on Christmas messages. I mean, come on. How many of you guys have been going to church every Christmas since you were kids, right? You know the story. You've heard the Christmas story. And so at Remix, we are not in the habit of telling the Christmas story. We always do some crazy stuff. So this Christmas, it's awesome. Starting next, you know what? Let me just show you the trailer. I'm not even going to talk. You should watch this video trailer right here. Is that awesome or what? I am so excited. This Christmas, forget Santa Claus. Forget the manger. We are studying The Lady and the Dragon. Now, you're like, where is that story from? Is that a Bible story? Yes, Revelation chapter 12. There is a fascinating account there where this pregnant woman is attacked by a dragon, and then she gives birth, and he wants to eat her baby, and God takes the baby, and there's water. Some of you are like, really? That's in the Bible? Booyah! I just gave you a story to read tonight. Revelation chapter 12. Man, this next 3 weeks, it's going to be amazing. We're gonna look at some Christmas, and you notice I didn't call it Christmas. I called it Christmassy because it's not really Christmas story. But man, the next 3 weeks, we're going to look at this. Bring your friends. This is the time to bring your friends to church. All right, let them come hear some good stuff. Anyway, that's what we're doing starting next week. You know what? Share this video online, man. It'll freak people out. Like, really? This is what y'all are doing at Christmas? We'll put the link on our website, put it on the Facebook. But anyway, what I want to do tonight is finish out our story on Joseph. And when I'm done concluding the story, I'm going to share with you guys 4 lessons that we can learn from really a young guy who, it's fair to say he was a young adult when he went through some of these difficult seasons. And though most of you are not in jail or have never been in jail, on some level, Joseph is kind of like you, right? You have some sense of promise, some sense of what God's going to do, but you're not there yet. You're having to face a lot of ups and downs. And tonight's message is titled From the Promise to the Payoff, right? Because God makes a promise in our lives, and there's a payoff. But between both of those, there is a process entailed in that. And so tonight we're gonna talk about that. So anyway, here's where we are. We're going to start in chapter 42, because in chapter 41, Joseph has just received a promotion of a lifetime, right? Dude is prime minister of Egypt. At the same time, his brothers, or chapter 42, starts with his brothers essentially searching for food. If you recall, Pharaoh had a dream, and in his dream, there would be a massive worldwide food shortage. And Joseph was wise enough to help the Egyptians prepare for that famine. So essentially, there's no food in the world. Everyone's hungry, and Egypt has food. Egypt was the only location with enough food in its storage to sell. So Joseph's father, Jacob, sends his 10 brothers to say, hey, guys, listen, we're going to die if we don't eat. So you guys got to travel to Egypt because I've heard there's food there. You guys go get food. And they left the youngest brother back home in Canaan with dad. Well, the 10 brothers arrive in Egypt, and lo and behold, the man in charge of selling all the food is none other than who? Joseph, the very brother that they sold away into slavery some 13 years ago. So they come up to Joseph, all 10 brothers. They come up to Joseph. He's the guy selling the stuff. And when they come up to him, they don't recognize him, but he recognizes them. And they don't recognize Joseph for a number of reasons. Number one, it was 13 years ago when they assaulted him. And the second reason is that, well, Egyptians or ancient Egyptians wore makeup and they dressed funny. So it was kind of hard to recall that Joseph. So Joseph knows it's them. But instead of revealing his identity to them right there and there, or perhaps even think about that was his prime opportunity to get even, wasn't it? I mean, he could ask that they chop their heads off one at a time just for entertainment, and his guards would do that. But instead, Joseph he puts them through a trial of sorts, not to punish them, but I think Joseph wants to see if his brothers have changed from the men that they were 13 years ago. And I keep saying 13 years ago because he was sold off at 17 years, and when he becomes prime minister of Egypt, the account tells us he's 30 years old. So it's taken 13 years for him to see the fulfillment of God's promises in his life. Anyway, from chapter 42 to chapter 45, Joseph puts his brothers through, or his stepbrothers through, what I can only describe as big brother boot camp. I mean, it's insane. Let me kind of summarize what he does with them. At first, he sells them what the food they want to sell, and then he hides their money in their bags and sends them off so that, it'll be like they didn't pay anything, to see if they'll return. He does that. He temporarily locks one of the brothers up to see if the rest of them will come get him. He asks them to bring the youngest brother who's at home, bring him back to Egypt, who's with dad, to see if they'd kill him also. I mean, he's just giving them one test after another. And once again, in chapter 42 to 45, you can read all of that. He wants to see if these men have changed. Are they still the same cold-blooded killers that they were in chapter 37 when he was 17, or have they changed? Now, impressively enough, the brothers do everything that he says to prove by their actions that they're actually changed men. And in some sense, the brothers prove to Joseph that they're no longer the same men they were 13 years ago. Now, they don't know that he's Joseph. They're still thinking this Egyptian prime minister just doesn't like them. It's kind of tense. Now, here's what I find most incredible in this story. At no point in Joseph's story does he appear to be bitter. I mean, I've had my older brother do things to me that were less vicious than that, and I'm bitter from time to time. I mean, if you have siblings, some of y'all can't even stand your siblings. And they even sold you off into slavery, right? Joseph should be bitter. He should be angry. He should want to harm his brothers. But he doesn't. In fact, you know what's amazing about this? He is so overwhelmed at the fact that he's reuniting with his brothers that on several occasions in this story, he breaks down crying. Like at one point, he's asking him, he's like, where's your father? And where's your family? Where are you guys from? Are you come to spy out the land? And they're like, no, our father is still back. He's old. And Joseph at one point tells his guard, he says, go away. And he goes into the inner room to go cry. And Joseph is not crying because revenge is so sweet. He's crying because God has finally put him in a position where he could influence and really bless his whole family. And I find that fascinating because one of these days, most of you, all of you, will arrive at a point where you will be in a position to get even with people who have hurt you in some form or another. And you'll have the opportunity, maybe not to, sell them into slavery or kill them, but you'll have an opportunity to make life a little difficult for them. Perhaps you work at the same place and you get that promotion and you're finally the boss and you can finally do some things back to that person, right? And Joseph doesn't do any of that. He doesn't do any of that. He's overwhelmed because he understands that God has strategically moved him from place to place to place to place to put him here. And I think Joseph gets that it's not my place to get even. The vengeance belongs to the Lord. But beyond that, I think he's just happy to see his brothers. Remember, he's in Egypt alone. Anyway, after many days of putting his brothers through the ringer and determining that they're men, that they've changed, that they're different from the men who they were many years ago, finally in that account in Genesis chapter 45, let me read it to you. It's amazing. And you got to put yourself in the story. Genesis chapter 45, verse 1 to 15 or so. Joseph has not seen his brothers or his family in 15 years. He's been in prison. He's been arrested. He's been a slave. Finally, he sees his brothers. He hears that his dad is still around. He hears that his younger brother is still alive. And so put yourself in that room, that palace. 10 brothers scared out of their minds that this Pharaoh guy is going to kill him. Joseph knows who they are. Here's what happens. Genesis 45, verse 1. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So left in the room, there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And here it is. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. And here comes the big reveal. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" Picture his brothers when I read this. But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. You think? He's not dead. This is bad for us, right? I mean, they sold him into slavery thinking, let the guys do the murder deed for us. Verse 4, then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." That's funny. When they had done so, he said, "Listen, guys, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed. And don't be angry. Think about the level of grace and mercy that's been extended. He says, do not be distressed and do not be afraid. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there has been famine in this land. And for the next 5 years, there'll be no plowing, no reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth to save your lives by great deliverance. So then, it wasn't you who sent me here, but God. Please think about how much pain he's been in. He says, it's not you who sent me, it was God. He made me father to Pharaoh. In other words, he gave me great influence over Pharaoh. He made me lord of his entire household and ruler of all of Egypt. Verse 9, now guys, hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay, please, Dad. You shall live in the region of Goshen, and you'll be near me, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. And I'll provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are about to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. Guys, you can see for yourself, and so can my brother Benjamin. And by the way, Joseph had 10 stepbrothers, but from his mom, he had a younger brother named Benjamin, who apparently is the youngest and still alive. And he says, you can see for yourselves, and you can see my brother Benjamin, that it's really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor that was accorded me in Egypt and about everything you've seen, and bring my father down here quickly. And then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping. And he kissed all his brothers and wept over him. And afterwards, I love this, he talked with his brothers kindly, depending on what verse you have. You know, it's funny. Every time I've read this story, you know, I'm in my office. It's weird. I usually close my door when I read the story because I cry I don't know why I cry. And I was telling my wife, I said, I don't know why I cry. And she's like, maybe you felt you were sold when you were a kid. I don't know. I'm like, you know, we were joking. I'm like, I don't read, you know, I guess I'm moved by this story because, you know, when his brothers are selling him into slavery, they actually say that he was distressed. He was crying out, don't sell me. And so here's your chance to get even. And he doesn't do that. Instead, he goes the exact opposite and says, forget all of that stuff. I know you guys meant it for bad, but God worked it for good. So it's not my place to get even. Matter of fact, I'm going to bless y'all. What an amazing, amazing. And some of you, once again, will have the opportunity to pay back people who offended you. It might not be on this scale, but in a very tiny way, you'll have an opportunity to get back. And in that moment, you can either recognize that God is through God's grace that you have ascended through whatever ranks you have. Or you can say, you know, I busted my tail to get up here, payback time. Your call. Anyway, the story goes on to say Joseph is finally reunited with his father. He and Jacob meet each other. It's a very tearful scene when you read that account in Genesis, in the later Genesis chapter 50. Later on, Jacob, that's Joseph's father, dies at a ripe old age, and his brothers, is fascinating, his brothers in that account get nervous because they're like, uh-oh, dad's gone. Joseph is going to get even now. They literally say that. And in chapter 50, verse 19, Joseph says, listen, guys, chapter 50, verse 19, Joseph reassures them. I love this. Like the only person, one could argue and say, well, he doesn't want to kill them because their father's still alive, but dad's dead. And Joseph says in chapter 50, verse 19, guys, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid, for I'll provide for you and your children. And he reassured them, and I love this last part, and he spoke kindly to them. I think many of us, we might be willing to, forgive them, but we don't want to talk with them. And Joseph adds that bonus in there. He doesn't just forgive them. They're back in a right relationship. It's fascinating. And that's the end of the story. So here's what I want to do. Let me share with you 4 things that I think you and I can really pick up from Joseph's story. And here's where you fill in your notes. 4 things that, because it says Joseph, think about this, sold in slavery at 17, becomes prime minister of Egypt at 30, reunites with his brothers sometime around then, and the story concludes by saying he lived till age 110. That's a lot of life. He lived a good life, died a good death. And so let me share 4 things that I think you and I can learn about moving from God's promises to the payoff. You guys get that concept? To move from a promise God has made in your life through whatever process it is to the payoff. Here it is. Number 1, the path to God's promises in your life is a good one. The path to God's promises in your life is rarely ever a straight line, or is rarely ever a straight line. All right? Consider the number of stops, restarts, and detours that Joseph's life had to take from the time that God made the promise to him at age 17 that he would be somebody till age 30 when he actually became somebody. Think about all that happened in those 13 years. Let me recap it for you really quick. Well, number 1, he was thrown into a ditch by his brothers in a remote location with the intention of being killed. When that didn't work, they sold him into slavery. So he was yanked away by Midianite slave traders. He was purchased by the head of king's bodyguard in Egypt, so he's far away from home. I mean, I talked about this during the second message. I said, that's like being suddenly kidnapped, thrown in a van, and you wake up, find out that you're in some village in Shah, Iran, working as a slave of some mullah. And you have no means of contacting your family. That's what happened to Joseph. He ends up in prison as falsely accused. And it's only after all these, what I describe as detours and stops, that he gets to his final destination. You know what I think? I think most of us expect God to take us from where we are to what we've been praying for. Lord, I want to be this someday, or I want to have this someday. And we make a list for God. Maybe not an actual list, though some of us did. Right? We kind of have, Lord, this is what I want. And rightly so, I think God says, come to me and ask, right? And that's great. God wants us to come to him with our list. But I think what you and I often expect is, it's a straight line, right? I asked for this, you should give it to me. And here's what I know about God in my limited experience as a follower of Jesus Christ. And I say limited because compared to others who've lived longer than I have, I'm limited. We expect God's promise to the payoff to be a straight line. But oftentimes, God's promises to us is more of a zigzag line. And so we start off trusting God, and he says, I'm going to do this in your life. But he doesn't do it right away, because what God might do is that he might start here and then take you back there, right? And then spend some time back there and then bring you up here a little bit, because, this season will teach you some things. And then God's like, you know what, let's go back there. Let's go pick up some more things, okay? And when we're done there, God takes you in the complete opposite direction. And you're like, that's where I'm going, God. And he's like, no, that's not where we're going, right? And he has you here in this season. And you're like, really, God? You forgot me? And God's like, no, I got you. And then he takes you over here. And it looks like, where are you going, God? Like, where is this promise? Like, what, have you forgotten me? How many of you guys have wondered if God has actually forgotten you, right? Like, seriously, dude. I mean, you wouldn't say that to God, but seriously, God, right? And God, and you're like, I don't know if you know what you're doing, God. And God's like, that is part of the plan. You see, because between God's promises and between the payoff, between the promise of God and the payoff of God's promises, there's a long process. Pastor Armin says that. He says, We often expect God to work in hours and minutes and days, but the God of the Bible works in generations. So sometimes that could be a decade. Sometimes that could be less than a decade. God is a God who works in generations. He thinks big picture. And so sometimes between the promise and the payoff, God puts us through this process. And here's the deal. The process sometimes involves being broken. It'll involve some victories and some celebration moments. It involves pain. Boy, you want to be used greatly by God, expect some pain. I remember somebody told us in seminary, he said, if you're going to this ministry expecting to be liked, you should drop out right now. There's pain in the calling. And you know what? That's not even just for pastors. If you're a follower of Jesus Christ, you should get ready for pain. Now, your whole life is not going to be pain. I mean, it might be something. There'll be some wins there. But I just want to drive home that point, that between the promise of God and the payoff on God's promises, there is a zigzag process that involves ups and downs. But here's the deal, and we said this in one of the first messages. Your waiting room, which is what we described those zags, that period while you're waiting, that can also be God's work room, where he prepares you and he shapes you and he molds you. Because here's what God's saying. God is saying, where I'm taking you to, if God were to take some of us right from the promise to the payoff, here's the fact of the matter. We would mess it up. You're not equipped. You don't have the skills or the character or the right tools you need to excel there. And so God says, I want to take you through some life experiences. And in all of those places, I want you to walk with me because I am preparing you for the payoff. Is that making sense? Number 2, the payoff on God's promises is inclusive. I'm going to explain that. I was working hard to find a better word. That's the best I can do. The payoff on God's promises is inclusive, and here's what I mean by that. When God finally fulfills the promise he's made to you, when you finally experience the payoff that God has said he will bring into your life, it'll benefit many people around you. In other words, it's not just about you. The blessing is not just about you. That's what I mean by it's inclusive. When God puts you through the ringer in his process and you're like, where are you doing? And finally you're stepping into that position. You have that thing you've been trusting God for. Here's what you need to understand. Even if it was a very personal thing, you need to understand that it was never just about you. Not only will if it were a relationship, other people would benefit from it. Let me go back to Joseph's story for a second. Consider Joseph. Think about all he had to suffer during those 13 years. He was all alone. I mean, I've thought about that story. The account says Joseph, in one of the earlier chapters, it says while Joseph was in prison, he did a favor for a very high-ranking official. And before the guy leaves prison, he tells him, he says, listen, dude, when you get out, do me a favor, remember me. The account says for 2 years, dude forgot about Joseph. It wasn't until Pharaoh had the dream that he remembered. And I wondered at some point, December year 1, when Joseph must have thought to himself, really, this is it? My God, what happened to the dream you showed me? Right? And Joseph is so lonely. But yet, what happened? He comes out. He experiences, it's good to get a promotion, but it's better to get out of prison and get a good promotion. Right? He didn't go from prison to having a part-time job at Mickey D's, which, by the way, is awesome, in case you work there. All right. But he got a job ruling the country. Now, here's where I want to go with that. Joseph ended up being a blessing to who? Who? It's an easy answer. It's not a test. His brothers, right? He ended up being a blessing to, first of all, he ended up being a blessing to all of Egypt. But he ended up being a blessing to his brothers. Now, let's even step back for a second. How many tribes are there in Israel? 12 tribes. The entire Israelite nation that we know today comes from those 12 brothers. Think about that. The Israelites right now who are in insane fights with Hamas, right? They've kind of resolved some of that. Those people are descendants of Joseph and the 10 brothers and the 11 brothers. And so think about it from God's perspective. God says there's a whole nation that'll come from these 12 brothers. the way I'm going to bless them and preserve them is by one brother going through all of this, but getting to a position of influence. So here's where I'm getting at. When I say God's promises and the payoff on God's promises is inclusive, it means that when God takes you to where he's going to take you, wherever it is you've been trusting him for, it ain't just about you. There are people around you whom God is preparing, whom God's going to bless, whom God's going to pour into their lives because of the position of leadership or influence God's going to place you in. I mean, you're thinking, perhaps you're going to date someone and you're thinking, well, how's that going to be a blessing? Well, it could be that the person you're going to end up with is your relationship will be a blessing to others. And perhaps other younger couples will see you as a couple and believe that, wow, it is possible to walk with God, right? So I'm just using that as an example to say, even if it's on a very personal level, whatever God brings into your life, it's going to end up blessing people around you. So on that note, you got to kind of approach it as saying, you know what, okay, my waiting is not all about me. Third point. This one is hard. Resist the urge to turn bitter during the long waiting process, and resist the urge to get even during the payoff. I said this already, right? Resist the urge to get bitter during the process, and resist the urge to get even during the payoff. Man, I tell you, it is. How many of you guys don't like waiting? That's a dumb question, but some of you guys actually do enjoy waiting. Most of us. Actually, half of the room. Wow, the rest of you guys like waiting? Really? Okay, you just want to raise up your hand. I'm like, really? What's wrong with y'all? All right. Here's what I know. We can become easily jaded or even cynical when we've been waiting. My wife and I were talking about the return of Jesus Christ, and we were talking about like Israel and the end times, and I made a comment to her. I said, everyone today is like, oh, Jesus is coming back soon. And I believe that. I obviously do. But here's the fact of the matter, and this might disappoint some of you, but trust me, I'm trying to build you up. I don't want to discourage you. Here's the fact of the matter. The disciples of Jesus Christ, they thought Jesus was coming back next week. You see what I'm saying? Like there's a waiting. There have been people for 2,000 years who've been thinking Jesus is going to come next year, right? He is going to come soon. I know. There are things that have happened on the prophetic calendar that cause us to believe that we are closer now than every other generation has. There are certain prophetic things that need to happen. Let's just say 4 prophetic things that need to happen before Jesus comes back. And I got to say about 80% of that has been done. And so we know for certain we're closer to the return of Christ than ever. But I veer off my point. What I was trying to say was that it is easy for us to become cynical and jaded when the things we're expecting God to do doesn't happen in time. When we're waiting longer than we're comfortable with, we can become bitter. I mean, if anybody had reason to be bitter, think about Joseph. This dude could have grown up to be really messed up. I mean, this is the kind of guy you meet at CCM. I went to CCM, so I'm not knocking on you if you went there. This is the kind of guy you meet at CCM, you just sit next to in class, and they're just like, man, get off my sheet. Get off my sheet of paper, or get off my chair. They just don't even want you around them. Like, they're just really, you ever talk to people who are just bitter for no reason? Like, what's eating you up, right? Joseph could have been that guy, but somehow he isn't. Not once do we see that in his life. And I'm convinced that the only reason that Joseph was able to resist those urges to become bitter or cynical or jaded is the next point, and it's this. He understood that God, and here's the biggest point for you guys, God is in charge of all the starts, stops, and transitions of your life. Boy, take this one to the bank, man. God is in charge of all the starts, stops, and transitions in your life. So here it is. If you're in here tonight and you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you need to embrace the truth. Are you listening? You need to embrace the truth that every day of your life, from the moment you were conceived in your mother's womb till the day you will take your final breath, and your time in every day of your life was written in God's journal before you ever lived one of them. I'm not asking you to just, you need to embrace that. Psalm 139. Right? literally says, all the days of my life were written in your book before one of them came to be. There is nothing that happens in your life where God says, where did that come from? God is not thrown off when things go sour in your life. God doesn't sit in heaven going, oh, okay, Jesus, this is bad. Holy Spirit, you want to get in on this? What are we going to do? All of eternity, from eternity past to eternity yet to come, which is an unfathomable time, your little life, however long it is in between eternity past, all of it is written out in God's book before one of them came to be. And here's the encouragement in that. It means that every detour that your life will take, get this, even if it's a result of your own foolish actions or a result or the consequential actions of someone else, and so someone else does something stupid that throws you off the path that God's put you on, because every day of your life was written in God's book, in God's journal, before one of them came to be, God will bring you back on track. Joseph had a dream at 17 he would be king, and he went to jail. He went to Egypt. You know how many times Joseph must have thought to himself, well, there goes that plan. But what did God do? In spite of some of his own personal immaturity, and in spite of his brother's death wish, if you will, God worked it out for good for him, and ultimately for God's glory. So let me end with this, and I literally will end with this because Baptist pastors don't end when they say they'll end. So I'm going to end with this. If you take one thing away from this sermon, here it is. You listening? Okay. God, your Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, will finish and will bring to completion the good work that he's begun in you. He's going to do this. He's going to finish the work he's started in you. Amen?